The smell hit before anything else, a heavy, rotten mix of sweat, fear, waste, and something that felt ancient and wrong. Across the rough stones of Rome, a woman staggered forward, her body stripped bare and smeared with filth, fresh cuts still leaking down her skin. People filled the streets, thousands of them, shouting with excitement as if hunger itself lived inside their voices. Their noise pushed her toward the huge open mouth of the arena. But this wasn't just some normal public killing. This was Rome. And what happened here tore apart any idea of civilization you think the ancient world had. For centuries, scholars have tried to soften this truth or hide it altogether. Some still avoid telling it. But I'm about to show you 3 cold facts that will change the way you see human nature. First, how Rome turned someone's final moments into a complete destruction of dignity. Second, the exact kinds of crimes that led people, especially women, to this nightmare. And third, why emperors didn't just approve these punishments, they attended them, directed them, and sometimes took part in them. Prepare yourself, because what you learn here will reshape the way you look at ancient Rome, and maybe even the world. Around you, the stench reached her before the crowd's shouts did. It clung to the air: rot, sweat, old waste, and something that felt like fear made solid. She stumbled over the stones, body naked, skin smeared with filth, wounds still wet. People leaned over rooftops and packed the streets, roaring with a wild hunger that felt almost alive. Chains rattled as she was dragged forward. The arena waited like a giant open mouth. But this scene was not a simple punishment. It was a message. Rome wanted every person who watched to understand exactly what happened. When someone challenged its power, modern people talk about Roman greatness, architecture, law, philosophy, but few know how closely cruelty was tied to everything Rome built. Death alone wasn't enough for them. They needed fear. They needed humiliation so deep it reached past death. Public executions were planned like stage plays. Every step she took, every moment of shame, was prepared beforehand by officials who knew exactly how to break a human being. Without killing them too quickly, Rome didn't just punish women. It erased them. Not only their lives, but their place in the world. And the worst part was how much the crowds enjoyed it. Families came with children. Markets closed early so people could watch. The walk through the streets was only the beginning. What waited in the arena was far worse. Imagine standing in the streets of ancient Rome. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, spoiled food, and something else, an uncomfortable blend of fear and excitement. People crowd together, pushing forward as they wait for what they know is coming. Then you hear it, metal chains hitting stone, echoing through the narrow streets. The crowd moves as guards appear, dragging an unclothed woman through the forum. Her crime could be almost anything: adultery, breaking a vow, angering someone powerful, or simply refusing a man who expected obedience. This punishment had a name: condemnation to the beasts. But before the beasts, there was something even worse. Ancient writers like Martial described what happened during these marches, and many historians later tried to hide these details. The crowd did not just watch. They threw rotten vegetables, stones, and even human waste at the woman. The guards forced her to stop at certain places, not random spots, but chosen ones. Outside temples she once prayed in, by her family's homes, through markets where people recognized her. Rome understood that taking a life was simple. Destroying a person's dignity and identity was far more powerful. One woman tried to shield herself with her hands. The guards snapped her fingers. Another dropped to the ground to hide. They dragged her up and made her keep walking. And the part that chills you most, families were told to bring their children. They said it taught moral lessons. Relatives of the condemned woman sometimes joined the crowd to prove loyalty to Rome, terrified they might be punished if they showed sympathy. Guards were specially trained in psychological cruelty. They knew how long to stop, where to position her, and what to expose to make sure every possible layer of her dignity was taken away. But this parade was only the beginning. What happened once she reached the arena made everything before it seem almost gentle. The gates of the arena slammed shut behind her, trapping the sound inside like thunder. 50,000 Romans filled the seats, cheering with the thrill of spectators at a festival. But this wasn't a fight between gladiators, and it wasn't a hunt with lions. This was something far darker. Rome had perfected the art of turning a person's final minutes into a staged performance of humiliation. And what historians rarely talk about is how slow these deaths were meant to be. Women forced into the arena were not simply killed. They were made to act out twisted versions of myth stories everyone in Rome knew. They dressed the condemned as figures like Europa, carried off by a bull or leader, overtaken by the swan. But these were not symbolic portrayals. Rome brought in trained animals, prepared to attack the women in ways that mimicked the myths as closely as possible. The crowd watched with excitement, cheering each scream as if it were part of a grand show. Ancient accounts describe how these animals were conditioned specifically for violent acts, their behavior shaped to match the empire's cruel imagination. Historians like Cassius Dio wrote about the trial of Empress Messalina, whose punishment shocked even the senators. Accused of adultery, though in truth she had threatened imperial power, she was stripped naked in front of political leaders. They forced her to crawl across the arena floor while the audience hurled objects at her body. But this was only the introduction. Rome had a word for this complete destruction of a person, supplicium. Not just a killing, but a deliberate tearing apart of someone's humanity. Animals were brought out: bears, bulls, even horses specially trained to harm human beings. Families sat in the stands eating snacks, while women were assaulted and torn apart. And the most unsettling part? The audience wasn't passive. They controlled the torment. Thumbs up meant more suffering, more humiliation. Thumbs down suggested mercy, though mercy almost never won. Parents explained the cries of the victims to their children, teaching them obedience. The emperor sat in the best seat, watching everything. This spectacle wasn't just entertainment, it was a living warning. And sometimes, even after the animals were done, the women were still alive. The crowd demanded they be kept conscious for the final blows. They wanted to hear the screams. But as horrific as this was, one group of women faced something even worse. The fate of the Vestal Virgins made even hardened Romans shudder. Now imagine the most respected women in Rome, the Vestal Virgins. These priestesses guarded the sacred flame that was believed to protect the entire empire. As long as the fire burned, Rome would stand. Vestals were honored, protected, and treated as symbols of purity. They held more status than most senators. But the moment one was accused of breaking her vow of chastity, all that protection vanished. Rome then faced a terrible problem. Killing a sacred woman could anger the gods, but showing mercy could weaken the authority of the state. So they created a punishment unlike anything else, a fate worse than anything seen in the arena. First, they stripped the Vestal Virgin naked in front of the full Roman Senate. Not quickly, not privately, but slowly and ceremonially. She stood there trembling while senators debated her fate. This was meant to break her spirit before the real horror began. Writers like Pliny the Younger recorded what followed in letters that were kept hidden for generations. The Vestals were beaten with rods until their skin split, yet they were kept alive and conscious. Then came the most chilling step of all. They were buried alive. But this was no ordinary burial. The priestess was lowered into a small underground room with only a tiny amount of air. She received a lamp, a little food, and some water, not enough to survive, just enough to drag out the suffering. The walls were covered with sharp pottery shards, so if she tried to claw her way out, she would slice her hands to the bone. Every part of the chamber's design was meant to torture her mind as much as her body. The most haunting detail was the sound. People above ground could hear her screams for days, sometimes weeks. Families would gather nearby to listen, calling it a sacred ritual. Pliny wrote of one Vestal who survived in the darkness. For 18 days of slow starvation, trapped in silence except for her own voice echoing off the cramped stone walls. But the cruelty didn't end there. If a Vestal somehow lived long enough to be discovered, they did not free her. They executed her anyway, declaring that her survival must have offended the gods. Emperor Domitian personally oversaw the design of these burial chambers. He made sure the acoustics carried the screams to the surface so the people could hear them. He claimed the echoes were proof of divine justice. But this was only the beginning of Imperial involvement. What came next revealed just how deeply Rome's rulers embraced cruelty when they felt untouchable. The truth most people never hear is that emperors were not distant observers of these punishments. They were the ones guiding them. Some rulers treated public torture as their own personal art form. Emperor Caligula didn't simply attend these events, he directed them with obsessive detail. He planned executions like elaborate plays, choosing costumes, props, animals, and even the pacing of the torment. He worked with architects, animal handlers, and specialists in pain to invent new ways to break human beings. He wanted to create spectacles no one would ever forget. What made it more terrifying was that Caligula invited foreign rulers and ambassadors to watch these horrors. Envoys from kingdoms like Egypt or Britannia sat in special seats and were forced to witness Rome's creativity in cruelty. It was intimidation disguised as entertainment, a political message that said Rome could destroy you in ways you had never imagined. Caligula even built a private arena beneath his palace where he experimented on enslaved women before deciding which methods worked best for public display. Archaeological studies suggest these underground chambers were designed specifically for testing new tortures, away from the public eye. Then came Emperor Nero, who pushed the cruelty even further. He liked to dress as a gladiator and take part in the violence himself. People in the stands watched their emperor beat, torture, and kill condemned women while shouting that it was divine punishment. His actions weren't hidden, they were encouraged. To Rome, the emperor's participation proved his power, his authority, and his right to determine life and death. What many people don't realize is that this wasn't random madness. This was official policy. Rome used public degradation as a diplomatic tool. When foreign queens or noble women resisted Roman rule, the empire didn't simply kill them quietly. It humiliated them publicly. News of their treatment spread across the provinces like a warning. Entire cultures changed their traditional laws about women just to avoid offending Rome. Nations signed treaties that included promises to protect Roman dignity or risk similar punishments being broadcast across the empire. Rome institutionalized cruelty so deeply that they created government jobs specifically for designing new tortures. There was an official position responsible for inventing and managing public degradation. It came with salary, assistance, and recognition. Cruelty became organized, structured, and maintained like any other branch of government. But eventually, something unexpected began to shift. A growing movement quietly challenged these practices, and over time, it changed the empire in ways no one predicted. As the centuries passed, something began to unsettle Rome's enthusiasm for violent spectacles. Christianity started spreading quietly through the empire, first among the poor, then through households, and eventually into positions of influence. These early Christians questioned whether these brutal shows were truly honorable or moral. At first, their voices were small compared to the roar of the arenas. The executions continued. The crowds kept coming, but slowly something changed. People who once brought their children to watch humiliation began staying home. Some Romans started to feel uneasy, not just because of religion, but because the endless cruelty no longer felt like strength, it felt like shame. What had been considered entertainment for generations began to lose its appeal. Emperors noticed that the arenas were not as full as they used to be. Performers and executioners complained that crowds no longer reacted with the same excitement. Rome had not outlawed the punishments yet, but the audience itself was fading. By the 4th century, these spectacles were ending not because a ruler banned them, but because the people lost interest. Even with all the power of the empire behind them, the arenas could not survive once the crowds turned away. The shift did not happen overnight. It was slow, uneven, and often resisted. But it was real. Rome's appetite for destroying women in public faded after hundreds of years of being treated as normal family entertainment. What makes this even more disturbing is how long it took. It wasn't a few decades. It took nearly 300 years of moral pressure for Roman citizens to finally reject these shows. Public degradation was such a deep part of the culture that it lasted longer than gladiator duels, animal hunts, or many other famous Roman traditions. Archaeologists studying private Roman homes discovered artwork that reveals just how normalized this cruelty had become. Many families decorated their dining rooms and gathering spaces with images of women being punished. or tortured. These scenes were not hidden, they were displayed like ordinary art. This shows how deeply woven brutality was into Roman life. It wasn't just public entertainment. It entered people's homes, their daily routines, their conversations. And this raises unsettling questions about what a society can accept. When cruelty is presented as normal, Rome's long history of organized humiliation tells us something chilling about human nature. Once cruelty becomes tradition, people stop seeing it as cruelty at all. And even when change finally comes, the effects of that past linger for generations. Rome's long tradition of public humiliation leaves behind a truth that is difficult to face. The cruelty was not the result of a few evil rulers or rare moments of madness. It was an entire system organized, accepted, and taught. Every level of society took part. From emperors designing tortures to families sitting in the stands with their children. The empire convinced itself that these acts were normal, even moral. And once a culture accepts cruelty as part of everyday life, it becomes almost impossible to recognize how far it has fallen. Rome believed it was the height of civilization. Its people built roads, temples, aqueducts, and laws that still influence our world today. And yet, beneath that greatness was a darkness that people chose to ignore because it kept the empire powerful. For Rome, humiliation was not just punishment, it was a tool. It kept citizens obedient, discouraged rebellion, and reminded everyone that the state controlled their dignity as much as their lives. That belief shaped Roman society for generations. When archaeologists uncovered the artwork showing scenes of torture inside Roman homes, it revealed how ordinary this cruelty had become. These images were placed in rooms where families ate, talked, and entertained guests. People lived their lives surrounded by reminders of suffering. This wasn't shocking to them. It wasn't questioned. It was part of how they understood the world. The normalization of such violence makes us confront an uncomfortable truth. Any society, even one that sees itself as advanced, can justify the unthinkable. All it takes is for cruelty to be presented as tradition, discipline, or justice. Rome built an entire culture around the idea that public shame and suffering were necessary for order. And once that idea took hold, it shaped the behavior of millions. This legacy forces us to ask how easily humans adapt to brutality when it benefits those in power. Rome's system of degradation did not survive because people loved violence, it survived because people stopped seeing it. They accepted it as part of life, and once they accepted it, the cruelty continued without question. That is the most terrifying lesson Rome leaves behind. How quickly societies can lose sight of their own humanity. What all of this reveals is something deeply unsettling about human behavior. The cruelty of ancient Rome was not only the product of powerful rulers. It was supported by ordinary people who had grown used to seeing others degraded in public. Once humiliation became entertainment, it no longer felt like cruelty. Rome convinced itself that it was civilized while cheering for suffering. That stripped people of their dignity. This contradiction is not unique to the ancient world. It shows a pattern that repeats throughout history, even today. The idea of public shaming still exists, just in different forms. Instead of arenas, people gather on screens. Instead of crowds throwing stones, they use comments, posts, and viral videos. Instead of emperors directing events, online groups decide who is targeted. The tools have changed, but the basic human impulse to punish, to humiliate, to destroy someone publicly remains frighteningly familiar. Rome teaches us that when a society begins to enjoy someone else's downfall, it is already on a dangerous path. The Romans thought they were teaching lessons about loyalty and obedience. They believed their punishments protected order. But what they truly revealed was how easily people can be persuaded to ignore suffering when it is presented as justice or entertainment. The line between civilization and savagery is far thinner than most want to believe. Rome's legacy reminds us that cruelty becomes normal only when people allow it to. When crowds cheer, when families watch, when leaders approve, atrocities can grow into traditions. The greatest warning from Rome's past is not simply the brutality itself, but how ordinary it became. It shows how quickly a society can lose compassion when power demands it. And it challenges us to look closely at our own world and ask whether we are truly different, or whether we have simply found new ways to repeat old patterns.